Well, hello, everyone. So my responsibilities are twofold. One, I have a rather large responsibility, and then I'm going to close out the conference. So I would like to just walk over and say, hello. 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 For your contributions, I'm just honored to be here on the stage with you, and thank you for all that you've done, not just repairing the breach, but your contributions to our community across time. And in recognition of your contributions, we would like to award you this award, which says, Bobby William Austin, Ph.D., in acknowledgement of your vision, dedication, leadership, and inspiration, we present you with this Distinguished Service Award from Harvard University, Repairing the Breach, 2014. So as Charles Ogletree mentioned, I'm the Chief Diversity Officer and Special Assistant to the President here, and I've been here for about 4 years. And like I said, my role right now is to close out the conference, and I'm going to try to be brief. But as a classically trained academic, that is a challenge. So, but I checked with my corporate partners, so they told me this is brief. So let me begin with the thank yous. On behalf of the university, the president, et cetera, thank you to everyone. Thank you for the learning, the engagement, and of course, thank you to Dorian, Brian, and Ariana, men and women of our future. Dorian and I met a few short months ago, and then over a luncheon one day, he said, I have an idea. He came back with partners and a program, and then he showed me this program about 6 months later, and so that's what we have here today. And the story goes, I hear, that he told Bobby Austin that he would be speaking to about 50 people at a lecture somewhere, and this is the result of that lecture. So to you and to everyone, again, thank you. The magnificent student and members of the Harvard Graduate School, to the dean, thank you to our Tuskegee photographer, Carl Miller, and of course to the Casey Foundation and to all of our partners and panelists for their many contributions. Last week, I had the pleasure of providing a keynote for a Boston area consortium, and one of the areas that I covered was precociousness and children. I began with the story of my own childhood, and I was glad to hear Charles Ogletree was probably just as precocious as I, as a child. Suffice it to say, I will not bore you with my childhood, but I had the hand of God on the back of my neck. It was the hand of my mother and father, constantly reaching for me. And there was this word that was used to describe me consistently throughout my childhood, and I would hear it again and again until I reached graduate school, and that word was called potential. You have potential. Now, I understood as a child that meant I had the potential to be a number of things: criminal, welfare mother, a number of things. Potential had that kind of leaning toward. So my point actually, though, is how do we harness and innovate potential? How do we harness and innovate precociousness? Like my ancestors and family members before me, I have been the first in numerous roles in my life. I think back to so many jobs that did not exist 20 years ago, like iPhones or iPads available, let alone Androids, which were something only imagined on TV. So for me, when I think of excellence in higher education, I raise the question, how do we create what we do not know? Not just individual potential, but our collective potential. As Miriam Wright Edelman reminded me just 2 weeks ago at a presentation at the Kennedy School about when she was presenting about reimagining our schools, our future, our connection, she suggested, we have to be pioneers. She said, it was not raining when Noah started to build the ark. Not the Russell Crowe Noah, the other Noah. So as we think of our many challenges and opportunities today, the poverty levels, residential segregation, banking practices, incarceration, I am reminded of what James Baldwin in Another Country, where he writes that we as a nation are still developing, enduring, and have a way to go. But we can, quote, become our better selves, and, quote, and whatever one's journey, one's got to accept the fact that collisions will occur, end quote. In fact, they are necessary. So whether they are rear enders, fender benders, or even pileups occur, we must meet them with engaged enthusiasm. We must engage, as Dr. Wilson told us today, the outrage. That outrage that is directed toward a purpose-driven education. Furthermore, as Ron Ferguson reminded us, work that focuses on early childhood education is crucial. And as many panelists also remarked, we need to make groundbreaking connections between local and small businesses, partners across local and federal and state communities. We need to think about constructing our neighborhoods and communities and reconfiguring the conversations about Black men and women, that we are assets and not the problem. We must reconstitute our family, as Charles said. We heard about all types of educational models, assessments, entrepreneurial activities, mentorship, sponsorship, and many more. All of this will allow us to reimagine and have the tools, the data, and the truth to affect change. Now, in many ways, of course, I'm speaking to the converted today because that's why we all are here. Now, in diversity work, that's the work that I do, we think of learning on a spectrum, right? So there's low-level capacity, sort of low-level cultural competency, and high-level competency. I call it sort of idiocy to full capacity. And if we think about what Dr. Bobby William Austin said today in underscoring cultural diversity and why it's so important, let me remind you of two examples. One has to do with drugs. And we can remember back to the 19th and 20s and 30s when heroin was plaguing the African American community, and no one lifted a finger until the 1940s and 50s when it began to plague majority and white communities, and then it was a national problem. So this brings me to this question of the boy crisis in American higher education. And for those of us who study gender, as I have studied over the years, there are many of us who raised questions years ago when there was the African American boy crisis that perhaps we should start studying it then and gain some traction and learn from our mistakes until there was the national boy crisis that now, of course, has raised this agenda. So to go back to these earlier points, if we start to think and look at the sites of oppression, perhaps we could gain true traction and make mistakes that would lead us to a future. My life has been one of outrage. I am outraged. I remain optimistically outraged because I, like Baldwin, know that history is the present. We carry our history with us. We are the history. And it is here where history becomes, quote, a garment we can wear and share, not a cloak that we will hide in. We must not forget that the country is only as good and as strong as the people who make it up, and the country turns into what people want it to become. Now, this country is going to be transformed. It will not be transformed by an act of God, but by all of us, end quote. So I agree with Jimmy that the role of the Negro in American life has something to do with our concept of God. And this, for me, is the most oppressed among us have something to do with God. Baldwin goes on to say that from his point of view, the concept of God is not big enough. It has to be made much bigger than it is, because after all, God's not anybody's toy. To be with God is to be really involved with some enormous, overwhelming desire which controls power, which you cannot control and controls you. I conceive of my life as something I do not quite understand, but I am moving towards something, the God within me, that makes me move onward to a better tomorrow. So to the young futurists, to those under 33, I won't make you stand again, and I certainly won't make those stand who are over 33. It is true. It is not just, a young man was talking about truth. It is not just our crisis. It is a national crisis. Thank you to the young man who mentioned Marlon Riggs. I had the opportunity to work with Marlon early in my life. And if it were not for him and so many others, I would not be here, and so many of us would not be here. Potential would have not led the journey toward Harvard. Lastly, I'd like to say, I had the occasion to spend some time with Mae Jemison last week. Mae Jemison is an astronaut, as some of you may know. And Mae has this plan to get us to another planet. Now, Mae was a precocious child. As she described, she looked up into the sky knowing that someday she would go there, even though the only person she could have ever seen go there was Uhura from Star Trek. Yes. And so the reality is, though, Uhura would become her reality. She would go into space. She would become one of our first astronauts, and certainly our first African-American female astronaut. So as Mae continued her lecture, I believed. I became a believer. I knew I, too, would go to Pluto. I would go to Mars. I might even go to Saturn. Interstellar travel We have only just begun to imagine. So for me, it is here that I recognize, as Lilia Watson, the Indigenous Australian author, writes, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound with mine, let us work together. As we live and learn and work together, let us remember, as Jimmy Baldwin rightly declares, the world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in. Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions. Please join us. I know I talk very fast. I was raised in New York. Please join us at the Gutman Conference Center for the pop-up sessions. We will be there for another hour. Thank you again.